welcome to Les Bons Mots, a podcast about language learning by ACA, a language training school based in Quebec, Canada. This podcast is designed for people who are learning languages, and each episode will cover a different topic connected to language learning. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Britta Potion Reader. I've been teaching English as a second language for over 10 years, and I'm learning French and Spanish. Language is my passion. This week, I'm joined by my guest host and colleague, Kimberly Lamontagne. Kimberly studied psychology at Bishop's University and is originally from Baie-Comeau. She's been part of the ACA team for the past 3 years. We're going to be talking about some of the similarities and differences between English and French, a topic that's key to learning either of these languages. Let's get started. Kimberly, welcome to Les Bons Mots.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on the show to discuss false friends. You said that this is a particular interest of yours because of how you grew up?
Yes, so I'm quite lucky, and I grew up learning French and English at the same time, which for people who know where Baie-Comeau is might be a little bit bizarre, but I come from an Anglophone family. And one thing that always struck me as interesting was how you have these words that can exist in both languages that look really similar and yet mean completely different things. And considering how different the structure of English and French can be, I always thought it was quite interesting to see how those words exist and they can have similar or very different meanings.
It's completely fascinating and sometimes completely frustrating as well for people who are learning either of our official languages who already speak the other one.
Exactly. And to be fair, even myself growing up with both languages, learning them from a very young age and having that level of bilingualism, there's still moments where I'm like, wait a minute, I can say that in French, but can I translate it that way in English? Like, I'll have those moments where I really have to question myself and make sure I'm not making a mistake accidentally.
Definitely, it can be tricky. But when we talk about the history of English and French, it's really long and complex. And in terms of the linguistic evolution of our languages, a key date is 1066, isn't it?
Yeah, it all goes back to William the Conqueror, or Guillaume the Conqueror, if you prefer in French, when he became the King of England. So that's when Norman French became the official language of government, the church, and the upper classes in general in England. An early form of English became the language of the majority of the English people. And this lasted for about 300 years, and thousands of French words made it into the English language throughout that period. And most of these words are still in use today.
It's crazy to think how almost 1,000 years later, we're still using a lot of these words.
Again, it's funny to see how some words can disappear off the map and look totally strange now, and others can just linger for a very long period of time.
Some of us will recognize some of the loan words, like déjà vu or coup d'état, but there's also some words like naïve and fiancé, which come from French, and sometimes people don't recognize that, do they?
No, a lot of people think that those words are English words because they're so integrated into the English language at this point, and they're quite intrigued to find out that the word naive originally in English was gullible, and naive is actually the feminine form of the word naïf in French. And the same thing goes with the word fiancé, which was betrothed many years ago, and we don't really hear now unless you're watching like a Regency movie or something like that along the lines of like Pride and Prejudice and any of the Jane Austens. But again, fiancé is literally a French word that was adopted into the English language and is now very, very commonly used.
So these are cognates with the same origins. The meanings may or may not be the same. And some of them are false friends. Could you explain for our audience exactly what a false friend is? This is something we love to use as language teachers, but maybe not everybody's familiar with this term.
So a false friend or a false cognate, if you're trying to look fancy, are words that can be found in both languages. And either they look the same or they may sound the same. So you could have, for example, false friends that exist between French and Spanish, or you could have false friends that exist between English and German, where we have these words that are similar between the languages, but again, mean different things. In this case, we're speaking about English and French, being located in Canada. That's usually our main concern, but false friends can exist between any languages.
That's the key thing that makes it not a true friend, but in fact a false friend. Looks the same, but it's going to trick you. Goes behind your back. Not a good friend.
It lures you into a false sense of confidence. You're like, oh, it's fine. It's the same. No, it's not.
But before we dive too deeply into vocabulary, let's take a look at some of the similarities and differences that exist in the structure of the language, and specifically in a few of the verb tenses. I wanted to let everyone know that for those of us who are visual learners, we'll have a post on Facebook with some visuals showing exactly what we're talking about so that as you're listening or after you listen, you can click through to the post and see the information in a visual format. I'll put a link to this post in the show notes so that you can easily find it. The first tenses that we're going to look at don't visually look the same, but they function the same. So I'm talking here about the imparfait in French and the past progressive, aka the past continuous, in English. The uses of the past progressive and the imparfait are often the same. Not always, but often. Could you tell us a bit more about this, Kimberly?
Yeah, of course. So the past progressive, or again, past continuous, and l'imparfait, as we may know, are used for a past action in progress that is interrupted by another action. So, for example, I was cooking when the phone rang, or je cuisinais quand le téléphone a sonné. He was crossing the street when the car hit him, or il traversait la rue quand la voiture l'a frappé. So both can also be used for a past action in progress at a specific time. For example, in 2010, she was living in Toronto and working at Smith & Co. En 2010, elle vivait à Toronto et travaillait chez Smith & Co. We use both of these tenses for description to create relationships between past events and actions. Really, they're very cinematic tenses. They paint a picture, they bring you back to a story. So, a lot of novels might use this to really bring you back to that moment and make you feel like you're reliving it with the characters, that you were present while these things happened.
And we love to use these tenses in both English and French with verbal storytelling as well to sort of add the color and the life to the scene. And it's such a great narrative tense. It's so rich for that reason. I love that one. Not all of the uses for the imparfait and the past progressive are the same. When we talk about past habits in French, we might use the imparfait. For example, I could say je jouais le piano quand j'étais au secondaire. But in English, I might use the simple past or the used to construction to talk about the same thing. I played the piano when I was in high school.
Yeah, absolutely.
In addition to the imparfait and the past progressive or past continuous, there's another pair of verb tenses that we can look at that have a lot in common, and that's the plus que parfait in French and the past perfect in English. What about those two?
As we were mentioning in the first pairing, they just behave in very similar ways or have a similar structure. So, for example, in a sentence in the past perfect in English would be he had finished the report before he went home. In French, with the plus que parfait, we would say il avait terminé le rapport avant de rentrer chez lui. So, both of them are used to talk about an event which took place before another event in the past. Another example would be when I got home, I discovered someone had stolen my car. And if we apply it to French, it would be something like quand je suis rentrée à la maison, j'ai découvert que quelqu'un avait volé ma voiture. Avait volé is le plus que parfait.
And again, it's these storytelling tenses, these tenses that we use when we're creating a picture in someone's mind, when we're describing how something happened. We can see really the functional similarity between these two. Both of them are dealing with, as you mentioned, the past of the past, which is the way I always like to teach the past perfect in English. However, it's not always fun and games. We sometimes have structural false friends. And I'm thinking specifically,
Mhm.
Kimberly, about a deceptive duo. And that is the passé composé in French and the present perfect in English. Why are these tenses false friends?
I hear, especially my intermediate students have difficulties with this one because, as you were saying, Britta, structurally speaking, they're very similar. So the passé composé will use the same auxiliary to have, so avoir, that we do in the present perfect, but they're used in completely different situations. So, for example, le passé composé would be j'ai acheté un cadeau. And if you translate that word for word, as beginners often do, you would have the English sentence, I have bought a gift. This sentence using have and the English past participle is in the verb tense called the present perfect. But to translate j'ai acheté un cadeau, we should use the simple past. I bought a gift. The forms of the passé composé and the present perfect look the same, but they don't work the same way.
Thank you so much for breaking that down, Kimberly. And if you're interested in a little bit more on that tricky tense, the present perfect, I would recommend that you check out season 1, episode 2, in which Johnson and I discuss the present perfect. It's all about that. And as well, our colleague Lauren has a Les Bons Mots video on the topic available on our website if you want to dive a little bit deeper into that. Kimberly, in addition to verb tenses, we can look at similarities and differences when it comes to other parts of speech as well. Maybe we can start with adverbs. What do we see there?
Sure. So adverbs are words which describe verbs. Something like he spoke rapidly would be il a parlé rapidement. Many of the adverbs in French end in ment, and they would translate to adverbs ending in ly. So another example would be he watched the match avidly and il a regardé la partie avidement. So once again, both translate ment translates to ly endings for adverbs.
It's so handy when we have these structural similarities that can help us. Sometimes it's not a whole category. So we could look at, for example, adjectives. We have adjectives in English and French, and these are words which describe nouns. When we think about which ones are similar between the languages, we can look at adjectives that end in EUX in French, have largely been adapted to OUS in English. So, for example, délicieux in French becomes delicious in English.
Précieux becomes precious as well. Nouns that end in ité, which is ity accent aigu, become ity, so ity. Think of liberté, égalité, fraternité, turns to liberty, equality, and fraternity. Nouns that end in tion are often the same in English and French. Think of situation, situation, question, question, opération, operation.
And a special bonus tip for people learning French like me, these nouns are all feminine except for le bastion. Le bastion is the translation of the English word the bastion, which can be used to mean a part of a fortification, or it can also mean a kind of place or institution or person that strongly upholds or defends specific kinds of principles or attitudes. So this is the one exception in French, le bastion, of the tion nouns, which is masculine instead of feminine. This is a quick tip because a lot of us Anglophones learning French struggle with remembering the genders of the nouns in French.
And I say good luck to you. Often enough, as francophones, we'll get together and question each other. It was like, is it le ou la bus, le bus? And then there could be differences between the regions. So don't ask a Quebecer from Quebec City and a Montrealer to talk about buses because we will not agree on whether it's masculine or feminine.
Yeah, it can definitely be complicated. Something that I know my students struggle with a lot, and I'm sure Kimberly, you've had the same experience, and I've had my own personal struggles as well with learning French, is in the area of prepositions. So here we're moving a little bit more into the differences. So these are not so much the true friends. And we have prepositions in French like a, written with the letter A and the accent grave. In English, a is equivalent to, at, or in, depending on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And in French, we have one preposition, de, which is the equivalent to three different prepositions in English. It could be of, it could be about, or it could be from. In English, we have a lot more prepositions, and they're not always translated the same way. Sometimes this leads to a little bit of unintentional comedy because in English, I say I talk on the phone, but if I translate directly to French and I say je parle sur le téléphone, Kimberly, what is going to be in your mind?
I would visualize you sitting on the telephone and speaking at the same time, which would be quite a feat for sure. You would say instead, je parle au téléphone. We could also talk about verbs where some verbs have the same meaning, but they are grammatically different, which means that they function differently from one language to another.
So in English, some verbs are followed by their objects. So when we look at an English sentence, like we played a game, we have the verb to play, played, and then immediately we have the object which comes after it, a game. But if I translate this into French, it becomes a little bit of a different grammatical structure, doesn't it?
So in French, the same verb could require preposition before the complement. So, for example, if we take the verb play, again, in French we say jouer à un jeu, but in English we don't say play at a game. We would just say play a game.
So we have, again, the translation, we have the same meaning between jouer and play, but we have to remember the preposition in French. And sometimes vice versa. We have a different grammatical structure in how we use the verb with the same meaning. It's a little tricky.
This is something I like to remind my students, especially my Francophone students, that culturally speaking, the languages are a little bit different in their mentality, right? Where English tends to be straight to the point. Let's cut corners and say things as quickly and as efficiently as we can. Get the meaning across. Versus French likes to take the scenic route. We like to take a bit more time and really make sure that everybody is following the conversation at every step of the way. No one gets lost versus English, as I said, would go again, read between the lines, have you follow the general logic of the conversation.
So we've looked at some similarities and differences between verb tenses, between different parts of speech, but we can also look at similarities and differences in terms of vocabulary as well, can't we?
Absolutely. So there's many individual words that are the same in both languages.
And even groups of words sometimes too, aren't there?
Absolutely. So if we look at certain examples, if you consider medical vocabulary, perhaps, so many medical words have Latin roots, and that's quite common in English and Romance languages like French or Italian and Portuguese and Spanish. So note that the common words for body parts don't necessarily resemble French. So think of the word arm is bras or nose is nez. But if you think about the bones, so the humerus and the radius are the same, l'humérus, le radius. You'll use them in both languages. So even the name for surgeries that end in OMY in English will end in OMIE, which has the same pronunciation in French. So, for example, the surgery to remove the appendix is the appendectomy or l'appendectomie. So the surgery called mastectomy is une mastectomie in French.
And of course, we always have to be a little bit careful because words which belong to these groups aren't always the same. It's just a matter of realizing that there's a lot of
Mhm.
similarity in the language which is used. There are still some differences. And again, it goes back a little bit, I think, to the difference between the words used by everyday people in England many hundreds of years ago and the words used by educated people and the government many, many years ago. So this is why we have an arm, not un bras in English, but we do have radius and le radieux in both languages that are basically the same. Kimberly, let's get into some of the fun, juicy stuff when we look at false friends. So let's look at some of these individual words that are really common. And we're going to focus especially on some examples that are common for our students who are in business context and using English in
Mhm.
business context. And I think these are words that both of us have heard many times in our classes.
Absolutely. So one of the ones that keeps coming up anytime people talk about training is they'll use the word formation, but formation is training, right? I had some HR training yesterday and j'ai une formation avec les RH hier. If you think of another common one that you hear, especially for students or individuals who are still in university, they'll talk about our stage, which is not a stage, it's not theater. We're talking about an internship in English. If you think of the word actual, actuel, that is a very difficult one for many people. So actuel and actual don't mean the same thing. Actual would translate to en fait, and actuel would be something more like current.
Hmm.
Or if you think about actuellement, currently, or regularly. So again, a little bit tricky because they look the same, but they really don't mean the same thing. Or if you think of the word reste, which means to stay, and vice versa, if you say to rest, it would mean se reposer instead in French.
It's so tricky. And rent and that word gets even trickier because my students who speak French as their first language will often talk about rentability, which as an Anglophone, I think that's, oh, it's something I'm able to rent. Is the property rentable? But in fact, it means profitable. Rentabilité would be profitability, I think. Am I correct?
Yeah, it would be something that's worth your time, worth your effort, or anything along those lines.
And another one that confused me the first time I heard it is when my students talked about needing to report something. And it was clear that they weren't meaning give news or notice to another person about the event. It was about time. What is the actual word that people want to use when they're looking for the equivalent for rapporter? Because it's not report.
No, you would need to use postpone, or if you prefer to use a phrasal verb, you could always talk about pushing back an event. But yes, not quite the same thing.
And I think I've probably been guilty of misusing attendre because this is another word. The verb to attend something in English exists and attendre exists in French, but they're not the same. My bilingual friend, please help.
So if you were trying to use the word attendre in the sense of attending an event, then you're not using it in the same way at all. Attendre would be better translated as to wait. Donc j'attends l'autobus. I'm waiting for the bus. And if you're going to use attend, you would then use assister. Donc j'assiste la conférence. I'm attending the conference.
But that gets even more confusing because assist exists in English, but it has a completely different meaning. It means to help someone.
Exactly. And to make it even more interesting, it can also mean that in French. You could say j'assiste quelqu'un, I am helping someone. So it's one of those tricky words that not all meanings are the same between both languages.
Oh my goodness. And there are some other examples of words like this, which are, I don't know, semi false friends. Sometimes they're true, like assiste, and sometimes they're false. Could you tell us some more about this?
Of course. So semi-false friends, these ones, again, as you said, are quite tricky. You definitely want to pay attention. The first one that comes to mind is something like resume or résumé. So in both English and French, a resume could be referring to your CV. When you're applying for a position, you have to hand in your resume. However, if you have a francophone friend asking you to give you a résumé of last night's episode of Grey's Anatomy, then it doesn't mean the same thing. In this case, you would need to use the word summary in English of résumé.
Another word that I've noticed as well is used sometimes the same and sometimes differently is the word interesting or intéressant. So in English, when I talk about something being interesting, the vast majority of the time, I'm talking about something that captures my interest, that captures my attention. And it's really quite a cognitive process that happens. And I've noticed it seems to be used for that as well in French, but also more generally in French. How else is intéressant used in French that it's not in English?
I would say intéressant is used in a wider capacity. As you said, it's really more specific in English, but in French, we'll talk about une journée intéressante, quelque chose qui est intéressant. Ah, c'est intéressant. If you're being a little bit, if you're trying to be sarcastic, ah oui, c'était très intéressant. And we might mean a little bit more in the sense that it was very special, in the same way that we might use that word in English. So again, just a wider use in French.
Mhm. And as well for things that are financially interesting. In English, we might tend to say something is appealing, for example, and sometimes that's translated into intéressant, I've noticed, for the same kind of context in French as well.
Absolutely.
Another one that's tricky is realize. So in English, realize is like that moment when the light bulb goes off. In the cartoon, the light bulb appears above the person's head. They realize something. Aha! They have their eureka moment. Is it the same in French?
Yes, it is and not. It's a bit of a wider term in French where indeed you can have that light bulb moment, j'ai réalisé que c'était important. So you have that more cognitive moment. It's also used in a more physical way. In the sense you would say j'ai réalisé une tâche, which in English we can't say I realized a task. You would say I completed a task or I did a task. So not so much connected to the physicality of the word
Mhm.
the way it is in French.
So, Kimberly, have we forgotten anything? Are there any other false friends that we sometimes hear that we haven't mentioned?
Yes, there is the word experiment and expérimenter, which are not the same thing at all. So, experiment in English, you would visualize, or at least I do, like this mad scientist in a laboratory that they're working on some kind of formula of some kind. And then expérimenter in French, though, don't exactly mean the same thing. It would just simply be someone who has a lot of experience. So you could say, Britta, you are une enseignante d'anglais expérimentée, meaning you have a lot of experience in teaching English, for example.
Ah, but it doesn't mean that I'm an experimental teacher who's always trying crazy new ideas and inventing new approaches. I mean, maybe I am, but the meaning isn't there exactly.
Exactly. That's something for us to discover, but the word itself would not lend that image for sure.
Maybe we should just take a minute to think about how we can actually use this knowledge.
Mhm.
One thing that I would like to suggest is that if you're someone who's comfortable with grammar, you can use these verb tense tips to help you decide which tense to use in a particular situation. And you can use your knowledge of the grammar of your first language to help you express yourself in your second language. And again, we'll post some useful visuals on our Facebook page as well so that you can have a look and actually see what we were talking about when we were comparing the various tenses. That sometimes makes it easier for us to understand. But if you're not that comfortable with grammar, if you don't know the names of the verb tenses, it's not a big deal. Pay attention to what you see, what you hear when you're using your second language, and you will develop an instinctual understanding of what verb tense to use where simply by paying attention to the input and doing a lot of practice as well. It's not one way or the other.
Right, especially I would say paying attention to the context in which something is expressed, when a verb tense in particular is used, especially if it catches you by surprise. You're like, oh, wait, why are you using this verb tense? Just listen. What are they saying? What's the context involved? And that helps you get a clearer picture over time.
What could we suggest in terms of vocabulary and dealing with sort of true friends and false friends when it comes to vocabulary, Kimberly? What do you tell your students?
Honestly, the internet is a great resource. I encourage my students to go online and simply do a Google search, and you'll type in false friends between English and French. And there's lots of lists that explain different things. Things like what's the difference between ancient and ancien, which is not quite the same thing. So, ancient in English is very old, very decrepit. Ancien could simply mean former in English, right? So, if you're talking about mon ancien professeur, I'm not saying my ancient professor. I'm talking about my former professor, which is not quite the same thing. So again, lots of resources on the internet. Quick Google search and you'll get many different suggestions on different false friends and any traps that may be waiting for you in some of those words.
And I guess it also comes to using some of our regular strategies for learning vocabulary. So, trying to actually use the words orally or write a sentence, practicing the different words, especially the false friends that you might need to use in your day to day life or in your working life, being aware of those specific ones and doing a little bit of extra practice with them.
Exactly. And even going back to some tried and true solutions of when you were perhaps in school with flashcards, or if you want to practice with your children, that's a great idea. You can get just really, a piece of paper on one side, write the equivalent word in French, on the other side in English, and you have to rattle out a quick suggestion, a sentence of any kind using a flashcard system of repetition can also be quite useful.
And there's even some apps as well that we can use in terms of creating electronic flashcards. If you're not as into paper and pens, you can put it on your phone and review it when you have a chance.
Exactly. If you want to be very modern and very eco friendly, that's a great solution.
So, Kimberly, each week we like to offer a recommendation to our listeners, something connected directly or indirectly to language learning. Is there anything you'd like to recommend that we check out this week?
Sure, of course. I was just thinking back on when we were discussing the medical terms that have a lot of similarities sometimes or differences in English and French. The one thing that comes to mind is culinary words as well. So anything to do with cooking. I personally really enjoy watching the Great British Bake Off because it's just so wholesome and it's really pleasant to watch them bake away any troubles. Or again, any cooking show that you can think of are great ways of really paying attention to these French words that may be used in English and vice versa.
I love all of those shows in English, and regular listeners of the podcast will know I also love them in French, having gotten a little bit addicted last fall to a French series, which is the equivalent of Great British Bake Off, Le Meilleur Pâtissier. I got quite interested in all of the vocabulary as well, and learning the correct pronunciations, because a lot of those culinary terms come from French and we use them in English, but we don't exactly keep the correct pronunciations. Pretty educational to hear it with the correct pronunciation in these shows.
And I would say, as a French speaker, there's a few words where I'll have to crinkle my brow a little bit and go, what are they saying? My personal favorite, I think I heard, was pas de choux, which basically, if you're translating word for word into French, would be like foot of cabbage. But what they're trying to say is pâte de choux instead. So it's quite interesting, quite humorous to listen to those shows.
Most definitely, and always enjoyable. So this week I was thinking about the fact that we're located in Quebec.
Mhm.
And I think for anyone who knows a little bit about Quebec, they'll know that we have quite long winters. And right now in January, we have some of the shortest daytime periods. So, we're at home more, we're being cozy, and we have a little bit of extra time for our hobbies and our indoor pursuits. Something that I've been doing and that I would recommend to other language learners is investing a little bit of extra time in your language practice. So you could consider an evening language class. That's something that we offer here at ACA. You could have a little Netflix binge on a series that's in English instead of your first language if you want to challenge yourself a little bit. And depending on your level, maybe you'll have the subtitles on, maybe you'll have the subtitles off. But I suspect if you're listening to our podcast, you could do it with the subtitles off. I just have a sneaking suspicion about that. Maybe you want to find a website for an interest that you have and explore it in the language that you're learning. So personally, I love to knit, and especially in the wintertime, that's one of my hobbies. So I follow the Instagram pages and I watch some of the YouTube videos for different French knitting stores and knitters. And I get a little bit of vocabulary that I need for my hobby in the language that I'm learning as well. So I really enjoy that.
I've been working on getting better in my Spanish. It's gotten a bit rusty over the years of not using it. I like to view certain TV shows or series in their original language and really get a taste for the culture that way, of how each, language is so closely tied to culture and just the similarities between the two.
There's some really great Spanish language series available as well. Casa de Papel, I really like that one.
Indeed.
You have to remember that you're going to hear very different versions of spoken Spanish when you're watching like Casa de Papel, or if you're watching a series that's set in Latin America as well. And that's also one of the fun things.
Precisely.
Kimberly, thank you so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Les Bons Mots.
Well, thank you. I was looking forward to participating in this podcast. It's been great fun. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to have you back. That brings us to the end of this week's episode of Les Bons Mots. Come visit us on our website at lesbonsmots.ca, where you can find a lot of great blog posts about news, culture, language learning. You can also find Lauren's language learning videos there, and of course, all of the back episodes of Les Bons Mots. Do you have any questions or suggestions? We'd love to hear from you. You can email us at lesbonsmots@lesateliers.ca or find us on Facebook and Instagram at lesateliers.ca. Reach out to us if you're interested in learning more about our language training programs, or if you want to talk to us about ways you can improve your skills. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts to help other language learners find us. Thanks again, and happy practicing.